Well, this morning we're going to begin a brand new series called Beyond Blessed. It's based off of a book by Robert Morris, and it's something that I was introduced to him about 2 years ago at our general council that happened in Anaheim, and he spoke, and I've listened to him multiple times, even on this same topic, and every time I listen to it, it just pulls something out differently. And the idea behind this series is twofold. It's living a life that's generous and living a life of being good stewards. Because those two things go hand in hand. That a lot of time we hear people talking about, well, if you want to be blessed, you need to do this. How many of you ever have heard that before? If you need to be blessed, then you need to do these 5 things in this motion, in this action. Or you hear the televangelists on TV that if you want God's blessing on your life, you need to send 5 easy payments of $29.99 to my ministry, and you'll never see me, and I'll send you a bottle of special water that's anointing water. You can hear all kinds of things, and I think a lot of times in the church culture, we turn people away from being generous to the church and doing what God has called us to do simply because we make it a mindset of, if I give, then I get. That is one of the most dangerous mindsets in Christianity. We do not give so that we get. If that is your mindset, let me, this morning and through this series, help break that mindset for you. We do not give so that we get. We get so that we can give. And that as we are faithful and we give and we pour out blessings on the other people, God sees us as faithful individuals who He then blesses more so that we can continue blessing others. That if we maintain the right and proper mindset, we'll see that incredible and great things can happen. This is what I want you to realize. If you're in here and you say, you know what, I've never given a dime to this church, I never want to give a dime to this church, but I want to attend here because I feel God's presence here, you are 100% welcome. You're 100% welcome, because I believe that if you keep listening and God keeps speaking to you, that eventually over time your stance is probably going to change. But here's what I need you to know, that God doesn't need your money. The Almighty God who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, that the creator and the author of the universe, the one who knew you in the womb before anyone else knew you, knows how many hairs are on the top of your head or how many are not on the top of your head, whatever the case may be. He doesn't need your money. I'll tell you as a pastor, I don't need your money. That's why as I talk about giving and generosity and stewardship, I don't need your money. You want to know how I don't need your money? Because God sent a polar vortex to Michigan that burst the water pipe, that replaced carpeting and flooring in 5 rooms. God's going to bless His church. If God's church is a good steward and God's church is generous and reaches out to the community, God's going to take care of His church. I don't need your money. God doesn't need your money. But here's the thing with God. God doesn't need your money to accomplish His will, but He wants you to be a giver so you can be a part of accomplishing the will. When we participate in the will of God, then our life is enriched and we begin to feel like we are a blessing on our own. And here's even so much as what I'm going to do is behind this wall, directly in the back by our missions wall, you may have saw a table with a tablecloth over it. Underneath that tablecloth today is I have something for every family in this church, for every household in this church, is I have a copy of Robert Morris's book, Beyond Blessed, for you. Hard copy. I'm not going to go with any paper copy. It's a hard copy, one for each household for you to take with you, because I believe if some of these principles that are in this book that are all completely taken from the Bible, if you really invest and change your thinking, I think you're going to see so much stuff change in your life. Let me even encourage you with this, is when he talks about being a good steward, there's a struggle a lot of times that I think if we were to take a poll, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but if you say, I have loved ones, I have children who aren't following after God, and I don't know what to do about it, I'm distraught about it. God calls you to be a steward of everything that He gives you, both your finances and your family. And you do the very best job with what God has given to you. God is the one who owns your child that's lost and is walking away from Him. And if you're a good steward, God's going to take care of what is His. And it's this whole mindset of saying, there is nothing that I own. If God asked me to give up something, it's something that He has given to me and blessed me with. He has blessed me with my family. He has blessed me with my finances. He has blessed me with everything that's in my life. And if I'm willing to say, you know what, God, you have called me to do this, then I'll do this. If you've called me to give this, then I'll give this because it's not mine. I'm a steward. I'm taking care of what the master has placed into my hands. So this morning, I want to put a copy of that book into your hands. And again, it doesn't matter if you've given a ton of money or no money to this church. There's a copy of this book for you and for your family. Here's the thing. I think a lot of us in this room, that if I ask the question, if you feel like you have been blessed, we'd get different hands raised. That some people that we would look around and say, wow, like, yeah, they're definitely blessed. Or, wow, that person feels like they're blessed, and I wouldn't say that they're blessed. I think I've got more than them, and they're saying that they're blessed. The problem is feeling like you're blessed is not about how much money is in the bank account, but it's about doing what God has called you to do and being faithful in doing what God has called you to do, because he's going to take care of you. That ultimately, if we want to have the feeling of being more blessed, then we need to be faithful and do what God has called us to do. I want to jump into Acts chapter 20. This is verses 32 through 38. It says, "Now I commit you to God and to the word of his grace, which can build you up and give you an inheritance among all those who are sanctified. I have not coveted anyone's silver or gold or clothing. You yourself know that these hands of mine have supplied my own needs and the needs of my companions in everything I did. I showed you that by this kind of hard work we must help the weak, remembering the words of the Lord Jesus himself. It said, 'It is more blessed to give than to receive.' When Paul had finished speaking, he knelt down with all of them and prayed. They all wept as they embraced him and kissed him. What grieved them most was his statement that they would never see his face again. Then they accompanied him to the ship." So this is Paul's final words to the Ephesian elders, and he's telling them to be committed to God and his word of grace, because those are the things that can bring an inheritance to God's people. And that he walks through the idea of being a giver and the fact that Jesus saying it is more blessed to give than to receive. How many of you have reached that point in life where it is more blessed to give than it is to receive? Because think of it on Christmas morning. I remember as a child, when I would get presents, it was more about, like, what was I getting for Christmas? You could make this massive Christmas list. I remember Black Friday happening, the Toys R Us ad comes out, and being super excited because I'm going to circle everything that I want. And I'm going to hand over the list, and it's coming. And you get this mindset of, like, it's going to be good. I remember even one year looking at my grandpa, because I had opened all my presents, and I'm like, did I drop a present anywhere? Like, I remember saying that, like, I started looking through the cushions just to make sure that I hadn't missed a present. But somewhere there becomes a shift where all of a sudden I have a job, I have money, I have the ability to buy what I need. It all of a sudden is not, you can surprise me with something that I would like, and I'm like, I thank you for the gift. But in most cases, if I want something, I have the ability of going and getting it. But when it comes to receiving and giving to somebody, watching my girls' eyes light up when we built them this grocery set on Christmas Eve, that I now know the joy of hiding a big box for a period of time in the basement, to then putting them to bed on Christmas Eve and then having to assemble something and making sure that all the screws are in the right places. And what drives me crazy is when they put extra screws and pieces in the box, and there's one extra of everything, and they think they're being helpful. And realistically, no, you're not being helpful at all. Now all of a sudden I'm having to search this entire thing to find out where that one screw goes. But building that and taking the time and seeing the girls' faces when they came down the stairs, and they were excited because they had received. That receiving something has so much more power than giving. Or, I'm sorry, I totally said that wrong. I can tell them on Sudafed. That giving has so much more power than receiving. And when we look at God, God looks at us as he's our Heavenly Father, and he wants to give to us. But he wants us to be a model of Jesus Christ and then give to those that we see that are in need. If we stop doing the warming center ministry, there's individuals who desperately need a place where it's cold outside to be able to come inside into the warmth and sleep, that they don't have food, they don't have these things, and we get to be a blessing to them. Our foster care ministry, when we look at it and we have individuals who are coming in and wanting to take in children into their home, And that we get to be a spot where we train them so that they're able to do that and go in. And we don't charge this organization, the Judson Center, to come in and do this training. We give them the space totally free so that they can train. Where in April they've requested, they did it this month and they're doing it again in April, they requested a second room because they have so many families who want to sign up to foster. Let me just give you a stat that is crazy. That if 1 out of every 3 churches in the state of Michigan were to foster or adopt, there would be no children left in the foster care system. Imagine if just even one family in our church were to take that step, that journey, say, you know what, I want to foster with the idea of adopting this child. And then the entire church comes around them. And if 1 out of every 3 churches did that, there would be no children being passed around from foster home to foster home to foster home, feeling like they have no value. When we reach out and we pour into other people and we give, then all of a sudden we experience a true blessing, because it is better to give than it is to receive. When we look at Proverbs 11:24 through 25, it says this: one person gives freely but gets even richer. Another person doesn't give what they should but gets even poorer. Another who gives a lot will succeed. Another who renews others will be renewed. The key to all this is generosity. That it is a requirement of a Christian to be generous, to give, not because we're looking to get anything back, not that we're looking to make ourselves better, to have more ourselves, but if I give, then somebody else can be blessed. And if they're blessed, then all of a sudden they can experience the love and joy of who Jesus Christ is with no expectation. And that when God finds us faithful, then he will begin to pour in again, because he knows that he can trust us. And again, this is a two-legged thing. There's generosity and there's stewardship. We're going to deal with stewardship next week. But with generosity, we have to continue to be generous people. Because if we're not generous people, then we're not doing what God has called us to do. Because John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave. God loved us so much that he gave. He set the model of giving. Giving was designed to work selfishness out of our lives. If you look at yourself and you say, you know what, I feel like I'm too selfish, then we need to work on giving so that we're able to be individuals who love Jesus more. And here's the beautiful thing. Each and every one of us in this room has different levels of personal wealth. That doesn't matter. We can look at the widow that had 2 mites. Jesus said that that individual was the one who gave the most, not because she gave the most in amount or value, but because she gave everything that she had. She was faithful and said, God, if this is what you're calling me to do, I'm going to give this. It may have no significance in the general ledger, in the amount that the temple has, but I'm going to give what you have called me to give, not for show, but because I love you. Generosity changes the game, and I want to look at 1 Kings 17, 1 through 24. It says, Elijah was from Tishbe in the land of Gilead. He said to Ahab, I serve the Lord. He is the God of Israel. You can be sure that he lives, and you can be just as sure that there won't be any dew or rain on the whole land. There won't be any during the next few years. It won't come until I say so. Then a message came to Elijah from the Lord. He said, leave this place, go east and hide in the Kerith Valley. It is east of the Jordan River. You will drink water from the brook. I have directed some ravens to supply you with food there. So Elijah did what the Lord had told him to do. He went to the Kerith Valley. It was east of the Jordan River. He stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning. They also brought him bread and meat in the evening. He drank water from the brook. That's a good place to be when you're running from the king. Imagine this. You show up and say to the king, there is not going to be any rain or dew on the land for years. And it ends up being 3 years that there is no rain and there is no dew anywhere on the land. Except here we have Elijah, who's in this valley, and the ravens are bringing him food, and the brook is providing water for him. His needs are being met. He's being faithful in doing what God has called him to do, to go and share a word that I think many of us, that if we were told to go to a major political figure and say, the word of the Lord is this, and you're in trouble. But he does it because he's faithful to do what God has called him to do. When we pick back up in verse 7, it says, sometime later, the brook dried up. How many of you have experienced that before? You feel like there's blessing, you feel like God's doing something, and all of a sudden the brook dries up. And God, what am I doing here? Where am I supposed to go? It hadn't rained in the land for quite a while. A message came to Elijah from the Lord. He said, go right away to Zarephath in the region of Sidon. Stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. So Elijah went to Zarephath. He came to the town gate. A widow was there gathering sticks. He called out to her. He asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar? I need a drink. She went to get the water. Then he called out to her, please bring me a piece of bread too. I don't have any bread, she replied, and that's just as sure as the Lord your God is alive. All I have is a small amount of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home. I'll make one last meal for myself and my son will eat it. After that, we'll die. Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go home. Do what you have said. But first, make a small loaf of bread for me. Take some guts right there. Make it out of what you have. Bring it to me. Then make some for yourself and your son. The Lord is your God. The Lord is the God of Israel. He says the jar of flour will not be used up. The jug will always have oil in it. You will have flour and oil until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. She went away and did what Elijah had told her to do. So Elijah had food every day. There was also food for the woman and her family. The jar of flour wasn't used up. The jug always had oil in it. That's what the Lord had said would happen. He had spoken that message through Elijah. You have a widow who has little to nothing and is of the attitude of, I'm going home, I've got my sticks, I'm going to make the fire, I'm going to make one last meal, and then we are going to die. It's a very desperate statement, and we can look at that, and especially with hindsight, realize, well, look what God's about to do. No, like, widow, please, we don't even know her name, but widow, go ahead, give it to Elijah. It's going to be okay. Everything is going to work out okay. But how many of us have ever been in that moment where we feel like, God, you're calling me to do something. I don't want to do it because I don't have enough. How am I going to provide for my family? How am I going to take care? If God owns everything, then we can trust the fact that the God who is asking us to steward this and then give up this will supply our needs when we're in need. Elijah saw it when he was in the valley where ravens were bringing him food. Now Elijah is going to this widow and saying, make me this, and then go ahead and make it for you. And the food kept coming because she was faithful and did what God called her to do. And that's the key thing, what God has called you to do. When God says it, we need to be faithful and listen. We look again in verse 17, and it says, sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became sick. He got worse and worse. Finally, he stopped breathing. The woman said to Elijah, you are a man of God. What do you have against me? Did you come to bring my sin out into the open? Did you come to kill my son? Let's just stop for a moment. Here's the very individual who was preparing to make one last meal and die. And now time has went on and there's been plenty of food, and her son gets sick, and now she's blaming Elijah for her son getting sick. We can look at it and say, wow, like, she doesn't know what's going on, but how often is that us? How often do we walk through life and think, well, God, you didn't do this or do that? We need to always put our memory back on what God has already done and how God has already proven himself. That when we look at what God has proven himself through, then it helps us to get through the times that are difficult, where we're struggling. We don't know how we're going to get through here. It's like David with Goliath. David's first battle wasn't Goliath. He was protecting the sheep. And all of the wild animals that would come against him, he had his sling, that he would take those animals out. He would protect the sheep, so that ultimately when he had to go up against Goliath, he knew that he could take Goliath, because if God helped me here, then he'll help me here. And when we look at that in our lives and we don't look at the next battle and say, I don't know how I'm going to get through this battle, and we look at it and say, God's helped me through this one and this one and this one, if this is what God's calling me to, I'm going to get through this. Verse 19 says, give me your son, Elijah replied. He took him from her arms. He carried him to the upstairs room where he was staying. He put him down on his bed. Then Elijah cried out to the Lord. He said, Lord my God, I'm staying with this widow. Have you brought pain and sorrow even to her? Have you caused her son to die? Then he lay down on the boy 3 times. He cried out to the Lord. He said, Lord my God, give this boy's life back to him. The Lord answered Elijah's prayers. He gave the boy's life back to him, so the boy lived. Elijah picked up the boy. He carried him down from the upstairs room into the house. He gave him to the mother and said, "Look, your son is alive." Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God. I know that the message you have brought from the Lord is true." I think there's a particular reason why God picked this widow. Was because he knew that if this widow would be faithful in this, that when the time came where her son was going to be sick and her son was going to be in struggles and was going to have issues, that Elijah would already be there. The thing that we struggle with a lot of times is I don't understand why I'm going through this issue. And oftentimes we're going through one particular issue because God is trying to prepare you for something that's 5 years down the road or 5 weeks down the road or 5 days down the road that you don't even see yet. You don't even see it coming, but God has already prepared you for what's coming. And when we're faithful and we live the way God has called us to do, we're givers, then all of a sudden, when we are in need of a blessing, God has already provided the way that we will be blessed and that our needs will be met. So I don't think it's a question of should we have a blessed life or should we give, but the question becomes how much should we give? Which becomes a very awkward, uncomfortable question sometimes. I have no problem asking it because I'm not the one asking it. It's God who's asking it. This is a question that so often in churches that people have the attitude, and a lot of people who aren't saved have the attitude of the churches just want your money. Again, I don't want your money. I want you to be a part of what God's doing. But God is going to accomplish his will and his mission. The end of the book is already written. We already know that God wins. So it's just a matter, are you on Team God? Are you doing your part? And I'm going to jump the gun a little bit. How many of you are familiar with the phrase, "Well done, good and faithful servant"? We say that this is when we arrive in heaven, that we are going to hear that statement if we have followed after Christ. It's in one spot in the entire Bible, and that's in the parable of the talents, that the master goes away, he comes back, to the servants were faithful, and they multiplied his money. The third of it buried it in the ground. We're going to cover this next week. But well done, good and faithful servant has a financial connotation to it. Because have you taken what I've given you, have you stewarded it and multiplied it? That's what we're called to do, is we are called to multiply God's resources, whatever he places in our hands. When we look in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, Genesis 4:3-5 says, Abel took care of sheep, Cain farmed the land. After some time, Cain gathered some things he had grown. He brought them as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also brought an offering. He brought the fattest parts of some animals from his flock. They were the first animals born to their mothers. The Lord was pleased with Abel and his offering, but he wasn't pleased with Cain and his offering. So Cain became very angry, and his face was sad. Spoiler alert, Cain kills Abel. Cain gets so upset, and he realizes it's not my fault, it's Abel's fault. If I just get rid of Abel, then maybe God will be more pleased with me. Maybe God will be more pleased with my offering. And ultimately, it comes back to a heart issue. It's not the fact that Abel brought his flock and Cain brought his crops. But when we look back at it, Cain gathered some things he had grown. Abel brought the best from the firstborn. There's a difference when it comes to giving. Do we treat God and say, you know what, God? Here is the AT&T bill. Here's the Discover bill. Here's the mortgage. Here's this bill, this bill, this bill, this bill. And then I'm going to fit you into my budget if there whatever is left at the end of the month. And how many of us know that when we operate that way with whatever is left at the end of the month, when we don't have a plan with our money, that there's not a whole lot left at the end of the month? That a lot of times it's easy to have a lot of month left at the end of the money instead of a lot of the money left at the end of the month. But when it comes to this, that's what Cain did. Cain looked at all he had and said, you know what? I'll take some of this, and then God will be happy with this. Abel said, here's my firstborn, here's the best. I'm going to take this to God. When we talk about the concept of tithing and giving to God, it's about saying the first 10%. I think the reason why we hear 10% is 10% is a very easy number. How many of you know that if you have to figure like a 40% off sale or a 50% off sale, that you have to start doing the math in your head? 10% is really easy. If it's $100, move the decimal place one spot, $10. Nice and easy. I mean, we can get confused with if someone says it's 45% off. Well, how much is that? Let me pull out my calculator. Some of us can be really good when you see like buy one, get one free. It's like, hey, if I buy that, it's actually this, and we almost think like, hey, if 75% off, it's free. I can take this. This is great. I'm making money. How many of you have ever had that thought when you're in Kohl's before, and you see like the bill, and I saved you $400. Well, how much is on the total there? And it always amazes me in Kohl's, and I don't say this as something towards Annie, it always amazes me when I go and I buy something at Kohl's. I just want to make sure that that's the case. But if I go in and buy a pair of shoes and I see all of a sudden, I saved $70 on that pair of shoes. Well, yeah, because they marked it up to $200 so they can mark it right back down and make you feel good. But ultimately, we look at it and say, God, you're calling for the first 10%. That if you've truly blessed us, if you've truly taken care of us, if you've done all this, if you're going to pour back into us as we pour into others, God can do more with your 90% than you could ever do with your 100%. But we have to trust him in that. And we see Cain and Abel in that whole story. Cain reacts the way towards Abel because he's mad that he doesn't get the praise from God. Where ultimately we need to be faithful to do what God has called us to do. In Genesis chapter 14, 17 through 23, I'm not going to read it, but we see Abraham bringing an offering to Melchizedek after the spoils of war. That Melchizedek was the king of Jerusalem and was the priest of God at the time, and he brought that tenth, he brought the tithe. So we see the tithe happening, and we see offerings happening before the law. If we read through the law, we see plenty of examples of this is what the Israelites were supposed to do at that time. We move into Matthew 23:23. Jesus says to the Pharisees, "Woe to you teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former." Jesus comes along and he supports the tithe. He doesn't say, don't do this because I'm about to die on the cross and I'm about to change all the rules and it's going to be okay. He supports the tithe, but even then he says the more important matters of the law are justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Well, if we're really caring about justice in our world, then we should be able to give to our missionaries who are going out and doing something to fight human trafficking, to build water wells. That when we really care about faithfulness, we need to care about building up our church culture so that we can be faithful in our community, that we can have mercy on people who need to have mercy, that giving is a part of that process. It's not as a method of saying I'm better than somebody else, but is a part of that whole process. And if you are sitting in here this morning and say, well, I'm in the New Testament, the New Covenant, we're past the law now. Well, let me encourage you with something then, because I like your thought process. I like your philosophy. Acts 4:32 through 35 says, all the believers were agreed in heart and mind. They didn't claim that anything they had was their own. Instead, they shared everything they owned. With great power, the apostles continued their teaching. They were telling people that the Lord Jesus had risen from the dead, and God's grace was working powerfully in all of them. So there were no needy people among them. From time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them. They brought the money from the sales. They put it down at the apostles' feet. It was then given out to anyone who needed it. If you want to say, well, the tithe, that's for the Old Testament. That's for the old church. Awesome. Acts tells us that we're supposed to give everything that we have when God calls us to. So what standard do we want to work with here? 10% is obedience. 11% begins healthy giving. Because 11% is then us giving free will offering to what God has called us to do. And here's the thing that I just want to challenge you with. Again, God doesn't need your money. If you walk out of here thinking that, oh, this is all about money, no, this is about me wanting you to grow in your generosity so that God can grow in blessing you, so that you can continue to grow in generosity, so that he can continue blessing you, so that you can continue to grow and you can see the work of God being done through you because you are being faithful to do what God has called you to do. It all comes down to us being faithful because it comes back to John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave, that God set up the model of giving for us. That if he loved the world so much that he gave, then we should love the world that he loved so much so that we would give and do whatever God has called us to do. Whether that's somebody going and serving on the mission field and giving up their family so that they can go and love on other people who have never heard the word of Jesus and need to hear that name so that they can receive salvation. Or if it doesn't matter, so that we can continue getting this building back to where it needs to be so that we can continue having other events and bring in the community in here and also take our community out into the community so that people can see that this church cares about this community. We had the opportunity this week to meet one of our city councilmen that I saw on Facebook that he was requesting donations to help the memorial they prayed. And he was asking for $100. I'm like, how simple is that? That we could help out our community by donating $100. So we donated $200. And he came and had the opportunity of talking with him for a little bit. And he asked, what do you guys do as a church? And I said, well, we host foster care, we host the warming center. And he instantly was, well, what can the city do to help you with the foster care? And I said, forget about what you can do to help us. What can we as a church do to help you? And the look on his face was floored because you can tell he doesn't hear that. Because I don't need advertisement in a magazine, because God will be made famous on his own through his people. Advertising is not a bad thing, but that's not why I do it. I say, what can we do to help our city? Because if we're pouring into our city, then our city can be transformed for Christ. And we look at so much of blaming, well, this politician's doing this and this politician's doing that. What if all the politicians and all the people in our state all of a sudden became Christians and we started operating off of the way that God teaches us to do things? It changes the equation. If our worship team can come forward this morning, just as we go to close, I want to encourage us in two different areas. And I think you could very well fall into either one of these two camps. And the first camp this morning is simply that you've never invited Christ into your life. That as you're hearing all this giving and receiving, it's not making sense to you because you haven't received the best gift that's ever been given. And so this morning, what I would want to encourage you with as our worship team leads is it's simply this. There's no just magical prayer that you say that all of a sudden everything is perfect, but it's a heart change that says, I want Christ in me. I want to live a life that puts Jesus Christ first, makes him famous in every single thing that I do. Let him change me and transform me so that I can look more like the Son of God every single day. And I would encourage you, if that's you this morning, here's your 2 steps. As we worship, I just want you in your words to ask Jesus into your heart and say, God, I want you to be Lord of my life. I don't want fear to be the Lord. I don't want money to be the Lord. I don't want things, people, popularity. I don't want any of that stuff to be the Lord of my life anymore. I want Jesus Christ to be Lord of my life. Do that personally, but then I want you to go to our welcome desk afterwards. And we have a copy of a book of what next. What do we need to do to take those next steps? And we'll talk with you and we'll say, hey, what can we do to help you take those next steps? I'll let you know as well that we have water baptism coming up. Water baptism is the best way of making a public declaration that I'm going to live for Jesus Christ. So if that's you this morning, I challenge you to do that. And then the second thing is this, is a prayer to trust God with our finances. Because here's the amazing thing, is no matter where we are in our walk with God, this can always be a struggle from time to time. You may be here and you say, you know what, I've never given anything at all. And now you're asking me to give 10% of my income? Start small. Because if you're faithful and you do what God has called you to do, if you've never given anything, well, consider giving 1%. Because you're moving in a direction of obedience. If you know what, I do 2% or I do something randomly, well, say, God, what is it that you want our family to do? And I'll tell you this, if God truly says, all I want you to do is this amount, then be faithful to what God has called you to do. But if God has called you to say, you know what, I want you to consider moving to this next step of obedience, then listen and be faithful and obey, because there is no better place than to be right in the obedience of God. Because trust me, if we are generous people, we are going to wind up finding ourselves blessed and well taken care of. But we have to be generous people. If we're not generous, we have missed the heart of God completely. So this morning, as the worship team leads, I'm just going to challenge you to stand, and no matter where you fall, if you need to invite Christ in your heart for the first time, invite him and then come to our welcome desk. And if you need to pray and say, God, give me what it is that I need to do to change or be faithful, ask him, because he'll be faithful to tell you that. Let's stand and worship this morning.